imagine a quiet, peaceful village surrounded by lush greenery where everything seems perfect. Until one fateful day, the calm is shattered by an event so strange, so terrifying, that it leaves the entire town speechless. The story I'm about to tell you is one that has been whispered about for years, but no one truly knows the truth. It's a story of loss, hope, and something beyond human understanding. And as strange as it may sound, it all began with a simple funeral. Garrett was a man who lived a full life, loved by many, and his passing was mourned deeply. But the day of his funeral, something unimaginable happened, a moment that would forever change the lives of everyone present. As the mourners stood in silence, paying their last respects, the unthinkable occurred. A horse belonging to Garrett's closest friend, Nova, trampled over the coffin in the midst of the ceremony. Panic spread like wildfire, and gasps filled the air as the coffin was crushed beneath the weight of the powerful animal. But that wasn't the most chilling part. No, it was what happened next that no one could have predicted. The coffin, broken and splintered, revealed something that no one had prepared themselves for. Strange, eerie cries came from inside. The sound echoed through the graveyard, sending chills down the spines of those who stood there in shock. People tried to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the wind, or something more sinister? No one could say for sure, but the cries were unmistakable. They were real. And in that moment, Garrett's death became just the beginning of something much larger. Nova, standing there in disbelief, felt a strange pull, an unexplainable connection to the chaos unfolding before him. His horse, Nova, seemed to understand more than anyone else, moving anxiously around the broken coffin, sensing something that no one else could see. Was it the bond between them? Or was there something else at play? As the crowd stared, the truth seemed impossible to grasp. Was it a miracle or something darker? Could Garrett, in some form, still be alive? What had caused the cries? And why did Nova, the horse, seem so strangely linked to it all? There was only one thing everyone knew for sure. The story wasn't over yet. The questions lingered, unanswered, hanging in the air like a thick fog. And as the day ended, no one could shake the feeling that something beyond the natural world had just begun to unfold. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. But for now, we can only wonder. Was it a sign of divine intervention? Or was there something else, lurking in the shadows? The answers, my friends, are yet to come. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. The mysteries of that day and what followed will take you on a journey you won't forget. As the days passed, the village remained on edge. The funeral had been only the beginning, but the strange events surrounding Garrett's death had left an indelible mark on the community. No one could explain what had happened at the gravesite. The cries from the coffin, the eerie way Nova's horse had reacted, everything seemed to defy logic. Yet, it was not just the villagers who were unsettled. Nova, the man closest to Garrett, felt something shifting inside him, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn open. Nova was a quiet man, deeply connected to nature and the animals he cared for. His bond with his horse, a magnificent creature named Thunder, was beyond words. Thunder had been more than a pet. He was family. And so, when the horse acted in such a strange, almost protective way at the funeral, Nova couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper reason for it. Why had Thunder reacted like that? Why had he seemed so intent on protecting the coffin, as if he understood something no one else did? That night, after the funeral, Nova couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing the floor of his small cabin, his mind racing with questions. Was Garrett really gone? Or had something happened that he couldn't yet comprehend? He had been to enough funerals in his life to know that death was final. But what if this time it wasn't? What if Garrett had left behind something, some piece of himself that wasn't ready to be buried? Driven by a deep need to understand, Nova made his way to the graveyard the following day. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue over the land as he stood at the site of Garrett's grave. It looked peaceful now, the broken coffin replaced with a freshly dug plot of earth. But Nova could feel it, a strange, almost palpable energy in the air. Something was not right. He knelt by the grave and whispered Garrett's name, hoping for some sign, some answer to the questions that had been tormenting him. It was then that he heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. Nova froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around, but the cemetery was empty, the only movement coming from the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Yet, the sound continued, growing louder. And then, as if in response to his unspoken thoughts, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a woman, old, hunched, with wild gray hair that seemed to shimmer in the light. She moved slowly, her eyes locked on Nova as if she knew him. Nova's breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize her, but something about her presence felt familiar. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze held a sense of knowing that unsettled him. As she approached, she spoke in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "You seek the truth, don't you?" Nova's throat went dry. "What do you know about Garrett?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman's eyes narrowed, and she nodded slowly. "The truth is never what we expect it to be," she replied cryptically. "But it is out there, waiting, just beyond what you can see." Before Nova could ask more, the woman turned and began to walk away, her figure vanishing into the mist. But as she disappeared, she left behind a single cryptic message. "Look beyond the grave, Nova. The answers lie in the things you fear to understand." The words echoed in Nova's mind, a chilling reminder that there was more to this story than he could ever have imagined. What did she mean? What was it that he feared to understand? And why did he feel like this was just the beginning of something far darker than anyone could have anticipated? With more questions than answers, Nova knew one thing for certain. The mystery of Garrett's death was far from over. It was only getting started. Nova couldn't shake the woman's words from his mind. Look beyond the grave. What did it mean? And why did he feel like the very ground beneath him was hiding something? Something that had to do with Garrett's death, with the strange cries from the coffin, and the unsettling bond between him and his horse. Days turned into weeks, and life in the village returned to its quiet rhythm. But for Nova, nothing felt normal anymore. He found himself constantly on edge, haunted by the memory of the graveyard, the woman's cryptic message, and the nagging feeling that he was missing something crucial. There were whispers in the village too. People talked about the strange event, their stories becoming more and more exaggerated as time went on. Some said Garrett's spirit had never left. Others spoke of dark forces at play, forces that had been unleashed the moment his coffin had been trampled. But Nova knew the truth wasn't in the gossip. It was hidden somewhere, waiting for him to find it. He began to retrace his steps, visiting the places he and Garrett had shared, trying to connect the dots. Garrett had always been a man of deep faith, a man who believed in the afterlife and the power of prayer. But was there something more? Had he been involved in something that went beyond simple belief? Nova remembered the conversations they'd had in the past, late nights under the stars, talking about the mysteries of life and death, about things no one else dared to question. Garrett had often spoken of a hidden truth, a deeper understanding of life, one that could only be accessed through sacrifice and faith. It was all so vague, yet it stuck with Nova, gnawing at him. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Garrett had known something about life, death, and the space between them. But was it too late to uncover it now? Was it too late to ask the right questions? That was when he decided to visit Garrett's widow, Clara. She had been devastated by his death, and although she had kept a brave face, Nova could see the pain behind her eyes. She hadn't spoken much since the funeral, her grief swallowing her every word. But Nova hoped that maybe, just maybe, she knew something he didn't. When he arrived at her home, she greeted him with a tired smile. "Nova, it's good to see you," she said softly, leading him inside. Her house was quiet, almost too quiet. The air felt thick with the weight of sorrow. They sat in the dimly lit living room, the only sound the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Clara's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her eyes distant. Nova hesitated, unsure how to begin. But before he could speak, Clara's voice broke the silence. "You think there's more to Garrett's death, don't you?" she asked, her tone so matter-of-fact that it sent a shiver down Nova's spine. Nova blinked in surprise. I don't know. But something isn't right. The funeral, the cries from the coffin, and the way Thunder reacted. It all feels connected to something I can't understand. Clara looked at him, her gaze intense and searching. Garrett was involved in things I couldn't fully understand. He spoke of hidden truths, of knowledge passed down through generations, but I never fully believed it. Not until after he passed. Strange things have been happening ever since. Nova leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What kind of things?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering with fear. "I've seen things, Nova. Shadows moving on their own, whispers at night, things out of place. But the worst of it..." She paused, taking a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. "The worst of it is the feeling I get when I'm near Garrett's belongings, like he's still here, like he never left." Nova's stomach turned. This was more than grief. This was something deeper, something darker. Clara wasn't the only one who had felt it. Over the past few weeks, other villagers had begun experiencing strange occurrences, disturbing dreams, unexplained noises in the night, and the sense that someone was watching them. Nova stood up abruptly. "I need to find out more. I need to understand what Garrett knew, and why this is happening." Clara's face paled. "Be careful, Nova. There are things out there that shouldn't be disturbed." But Nova's mind was made up. He could no longer ignore the call to uncover the truth. Whatever Garrett had left behind, whatever mystery had been set in motion that day at the graveyard, he was determined to uncover it, even if it meant facing something far darker than he could have ever imagined. As Nova left Clara's house, the weight of her warning hung heavy in his chest. But the deeper he ventured into this mystery, the more it felt like there was no turning back. The lines between the living and the dead were blurring, and Nova was about to uncover a truth that would change everything, whether he was ready for it or not. Nova's determination grew stronger with each passing day. Every time he thought about Garrett, about the cryptic warning Clara had given him, the weight of the mystery pressed down harder. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were within reach, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for him to uncover them. But the deeper he dug, the more the shadows seemed to close in around him. He spent long hours in the village library, poring over old books and manuscripts, searching for anything that might connect Garrett, to the strange occurrences surrounding his death. Most of the texts were too vague or too ancient to make any sense, but there was one journal, buried among the forgotten pages, that caught his eye. It was Garrett's. Nova's heart raced as he flipped through the pages, the familiar handwriting leaping out at him. The journal chronicled Garrett's thoughts, his reflections on life and death, his questions about what lay beyond. But as Nova read further, his blood ran cold. Garrett had been investigating something that went against everything the villagers believed. There were mentions of rituals, of old rites passed down through generations, practices long thought to be nothing more than myths. Garrett's notes hinted at an ancient power, a force that existed between the living and the dead, a force that could bridge the two realms, but there was no explanation, only fragmented thoughts, and a growing sense of fear in his writing. It was as if Garrett had been trying to understand something too dangerous, something too dark, and it had consumed him. The journal ended abruptly. The last page was torn, the ink smeared as though Garrett had been interrupted. A chill ran down Nova's spine. What had happened to Garrett in his final days? Had he uncovered something that he wasn't supposed to know? That night, Nova couldn't sleep. His mind was consumed by the journal, by the realization that Garrett had been searching for answers to questions that no one should ask. As the hours passed, Nova felt the walls of his cabin close in around him. There was a growing unease in the air, as if the very land beneath him was restless, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until midnight that the first strange event occurred. Nova was sitting at his desk, staring at the journal, when he heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from outside. At first he thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, followed by a low, mournful cry. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same cry he had heard at the funeral, the same eerie, otherworldly wail that had shaken the entire village to its core. His heart raced. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and moved toward the door. But before he could open it, a knock came, soft but insistent. Nova's breath caught in his throat. It was late, far too late for anyone to be visiting. Hesitant, he reached for the door handle. As his fingers touched the wood, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over him. He opened the door to find no one there. But as his eyes scanned the darkness, he saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the woods, shrouded in shadow. His pulse quickened. It was the woman, the one who had spoken to him at the graveyard. But this time, there was something different about her. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and her movements were jerky, as if she were no longer entirely human. "Nova," she whispered, her voice low and haunting. "You've come too far." Before he could respond, she stepped back into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. Nova's mind raced. What did she mean? Had he really come too far? And what had happened to Garrett? The following days were filled with unease. Nova tried to speak to the villagers, but each one seemed to retreat further into themselves, as if they knew more than they were willing to admit. Strange things began happening in the village. Animals acting out of character, people experiencing unsettling dreams, and the once calm woods now felt alive with an unsettling energy. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to hold something hidden, something waiting to be uncovered. The tension was palpable. Nova knew he had to confront whatever it was that had been set in motion the moment Garrett died. The answers, he realized, lay not just in the journal, but in the place where it all began, the graveyard. He stood before it once again, the ground beneath his feet cold and hard. The whispers of the past seemed to stir in the air, and Nova could feel the weight of the land pressing down on him. He had come so far, but the truth still felt just out of reach. As he approached Garrett's grave, he could hear it again, the faint, chilling cry. It wasn't coming from the coffin this time, though. It was coming from beneath the earth. Nova's hands shook as he knelt down, his fingers brushing against the soil. And then, just as his fingers touched the ground, something moved beneath him. A sudden, violent tremor shook the earth, and the ground cracked open. Nova fell back, his heart racing as the dirt around Garrett's grave began to shift. Someone was rising from the earth, and as Nova looked on in horror, the silhouette of a figure began to emerge from the grave, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. The air grew colder, and Nova could feel the darkness closing in around him. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever had been awakened by Garrett's death, was now coming for him, and there was no escaping it. The final moments of this nightmare were drawing closer, and the truth, whatever it was about to be revealed. The earth trembled beneath Nova's hands as the figure slowly rose from Garrett's grave, its form barely visible in the dim light of the moon. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced for an explanation, but there was none. The figure, shrouded in darkness, was not entirely human, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling against something unseen, something that bound it to this world. Nova's breath caught in his throat as he struggled to comprehend what was happening before his eyes. The figure's head turned slowly, its glowing eyes locking onto Nova's. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't Garrett. It couldn't be. But it bore his face, twisted and distorted, a grotesque imitation of the man he had known. The features were familiar, yet unnerving, and the gaze that met his was filled with nothing but a hollow, endless void. Nova stumbled back, his mind spinning. Was this a trick? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by the grief and fear that had consumed him? But the figure moved closer, and with each step, the ground beneath him seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. A voice, not Garrett's but something else, rasped through the stillness of the night. "You shouldn't have come, Nova. You've awakened what should have remained buried." Nova froze, his legs unsteady beneath him. He wanted to run, but something held him there, a pull far stronger than fear. The figure, or whatever it was, continued to advance, its every step sending a chill through the air. Why are you doing this?" Nova managed to ask, his voice shaking. "What are you?" The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering the question. "I am what Garrett was meant to become," it said, its voice a rasping echo of the man Nova had known. "And I am the price for your ignorance." Suddenly, the ground beneath Nova seemed to shift. The earth cracked open wider, and from the fissures emerged tendrils of darkness, like twisted roots searching for something, grasping for life. The graveyard, once a place of peace, was now a portal to something far darker, something Nova couldn't even begin to understand. He watched in horror as the dark tendrils wrapped around the figure, pulling it back toward the depths of the earth. But just as quickly as the figure had risen, it was dragged back into the ground, disappearing into the shadows. And for a moment, all was still. Then a voice spoke from behind Nova, a voice so familiar yet so distant. "You've unleashed something that was never meant to be disturbed, Nova." He spun around to find Clara standing there, her eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't the Clara he knew. Her expression was empty, hollow, and her once soft features were now gaunt, almost skeletal. Her body seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as though she were no longer fully present in this world. "Clara, what's happening?" Nova's voice was desperate now, pleading for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Clara's lips curled into a twisted smile, but her eyes remained void of any emotion. You never should have asked questions, Nova. Some truths are too dangerous to know. Garrett was right to fear them. Nova's stomach twisted with dread. What do you mean? What's happened to Garrett? Clara stepped closer, her movement unnatural, as though she were being pulled by something invisible. Garrett sought knowledge that the dead should never possess. He didn't understand what he was awakening, and now it's too late for both of us. Nova's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. What did Garrett awaken? What is this thing? Clara's smile faltered, her voice dropping to a whisper. A curse, a force that should never have been disturbed. The cries, the shadows, the strange happenings, they were never coincidence. Garrett was never meant to walk that path. Before Nova could ask more, Clara's form began to flicker, her body growing translucent. The earth beneath them rumbled again, louder this time, as if the ground itself were in agony. And just as Clara vanished into the night, a final chilling message echoed in Nova's mind. You are the next sacrifice, Nova. The words reverberated through his skull, and the full weight of what he had uncovered began to sink in. The mysteries, the strange events, Garrett's death. It was all tied to something ancient, something cursed, something far beyond his understanding. The graveyard began to pulse with an eerie light, as if it were alive. Nova's heart raced as he turned toward the distant horizon, where a storm was beginning to form. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the darkened sky seemed to swallow everything in its path. He was no longer just searching for answers. He was being dragged into a war he hadn't asked for, a battle between the living and something far darker, something that would stop at nothing to claim what it was owed. As the ground shook beneath his feet, Nova realized the truth. Garrett's death had been the catalyst, but now Nova was caught in the web of a far greater force, and there was no way out. Nova's heart pounded as the storm raged around him. The wind howled, the trees bent under its force, and the air was thick with a strange energy. The graveyard seemed alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the frantic beat of his heart. There was no escaping the truth now. The darkness that had been awakened, the curse that had been set in motion by Garrett's death, was closing in. Nova was caught in the middle of a battle that no one could see, a battle between the living and something far more ancient and powerful. As he stood there, surrounded by the rising storm, Nova realized that Clara had been right. He had uncovered something that should have remained hidden. Garrett's search for forbidden knowledge had brought them to this point, but it was Nova who now had to finish what his friend had started. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. The curse, the force that had been awakened, had to be stopped before it consumed everything. His eyes scanned the graveyard, the glowing eyes of the figure still fresh in his mind. The darkness seemed to gather at the edges of the cemetery, as if waiting for him to make a move. In that moment, Nova understood what needed to be done. He couldn't fight this force head-on. It wasn't something that could be defeated with strength or weapons. It was a force of nature, of life and death, intertwined. The only way to stop it was to find balance, to return things to the way they were before Garrett had disturbed the peace of the graveyard. With determination, Nova knelt by Garrett's grave. He remembered the words from the journal, the ancient rituals Garrett had written about, rituals that could bridge the realms, but ones that required great sacrifice. Nova didn't have the luxury of time to understand the full meaning, but he knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about ending the curse. It was about bringing peace, to Garrett's restless soul and to the village that had been unknowingly caught in the middle of this ancient power struggle. He placed his hands on the earth, closing his eyes and whispering the words from the journal. The wind howled louder, the sky above darkened even further, but Nova held his ground. The tendrils of darkness that had once seemed so terrifying now seemed to shrink away as he spoke, retreating like shadows at dawn. The storm too began to settle, its fury waning as Nova continued the ritual, each word binding him to the earth beneath him, connecting him to the spirits of those who had come before. Suddenly, the ground beneath his hands seemed to pulse with life. The eerie cry that had haunted the village, the one that had come from the grave, faded into silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air around him was still, the storm gone as quickly as it had come. The graveyard, once alive with malevolent energy, now felt peaceful again. Nova stood, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of what he had done. He didn't know if the curse had been fully broken, but he knew that something had shifted, that the dark force had retreated. For now. The village would have peace once more, but at what cost? He glanced at the empty space where Clara had stood earlier. There was no sign of her, no trace of the twisted form she had taken. Had she been freed, or was she still bound to the curse? As Nova walked away from the graveyard, his mind was heavy with questions, but there was also a sense of quiet resolve. The mysteries of life and death were not easily understood, and perhaps they never would be. But Garrett's search for the truth had led to something greater than any one person could have foreseen. For Nova, the journey was over, for now. But the lessons learned in that graveyard, the power of life, death, and the unseen forces that bind them, would stay with him forever. The village would heal, but the memory of the storm, the curse, and the sacrifice made would never be forgotten. In the end, Nova realized that some truths, though painful, were necessary to confront. But as he looked toward the horizon, the world felt a little less mysterious, a little more at peace. The darkness had been held at bay for now,